today's conversation, as I framed yesterday, this morning, is around career pathways or multiple pathways, and how do we ensure equity in those pathways, and then breakout sessions on that. So again, going very high level, we're going to start big picture in this session together, and then go into breakout sessions that go deeper into career pathways. And this afternoon is a focus on dynamic teaching and learning. How should instruction change in our schools, or how should we potentially think about instruction differently, given these shifts we've been discussing, given the skills we've been discussing. So thanks for, I think, great conversations from yesterday, not only in our panels, but more importantly in the audience, and in your conversations, in your breakout groups, and your conversations at lunch. Excited for those conversations to continue today on the shifts in skills and competency necessary. We're going to get into that a little bit today, and how we think about pathways that develop those skills. So as we begin this morning, before I call up my panel, very distinguished panel this morning, I just want to hear some ahas, like what stood out to you yesterday, what was the big aha moment for you, or maybe not the big aha moment, maybe just a little aha moment. Kevin.
For me, it was really just grappling with these two paradigms. One, the career readiness paradigm for the 21st century, and the education paradigm. And the entire day I was just grappling with how little has changed in the education paradigm. The 21st century skills that we've been discussing are just, at least for me, in my experience, really just 20th century skills. They're the same skills that we've been struggling with forever. And we haven't talked a lot about equity thus far, and poverty thus far, but in this school we have schools who are beating the odds from all across the country and the world. I don't know, so this is the wondering, and I've been suffering with this, but I don't know how we close the gap, because now we have two gaps. We have the globalization paradigm and all the skills the kids need in order to compete, and then we have the skills that the kids need in order to advance a grade level, and our kids are thoroughly behind. So I feel really honored to be in this space. I've been looking forward to this conference for months. It'd be great to think about moving forward how we stay connected. I waited an entire year. I keep embarrassing her, but I waited an entire year to connect with Tiffany and her incredible school from Dallas, Texas, and schools that are not just beating the odds, but shattering the odds. I don't know how we make this a reality, but I know where I live in New York City, 90% of the schools are thoroughly failing. And that's, I think, a generous number. And we haven't been able to close the gap, and I don't know what to do about it. So that's my wondering.
And you're previewing my afternoon session of what does it look like to stay together. So thank you, Kevin. Yep, Tiffany.
I think for me, just the entire day, it was, I don't want to say an aha, but it was like, some of it was reaffirming, some of it was enlightening. Kevin and I had an awesome conversation. We actually committed to stay in contact with one another. Our schools are in a very similar place, similar demographics, and we're struggling with some of the same things. And so we decided that we were definitely going to stay in touch. And I had an opportunity to have conversations with groups from, from Singapore and from really all over the world. I had conversations with Germany and Singapore and some other schools, and we kind of talked about our similarities and our differences. And so it was, yes, in the formal structure, I told Andreas, I said, I'm an Andreas groupie. I told him this, right? So I love his presentations every single time I have an opportunity to come to these convenings. But it was also the informal conversations that I walked away with a lot of things and opportunities to sort of think about the work and the practice that we do in Dallas, and how we're going to maybe change and shape some of that work as a result of those informal conversations as well.
Great. Another one? Perfect. Yeah.
Was inspired yesterday that this conference was just as much about push and pull than everybody agreeing. Andreas's closing presentation, seemed to kind of rebut some of the thinking from earlier in the day. An idea that I had been grappling with the entire day. This tension between, how can we continue to to advocate for personalized learning, this intense focus on self versus, the collaboration that we know the industries are looking for, and then Andreas is just the presentation of the data, specifically, the Chinese students being able to excel academically, by themselves, yet collaboratively struggling. I think those kind of pushbacks, that kind of sharpening is what's going to make us better as we think a little deeper on those subjects.
Yeah, definitely, and living into those tensions that that we will continue to discuss today. So John started us yesterday morning with challenging us on 3 questions: to write down our vision for our school, to really think about that as we go into these 2 days of learning. So I want to draw us back to that, and if you have that piece of paper, I want you to bring that out, or if you wrote it on your laptop or computer, I know a lot of people are doing it digitally. Bring back that or think about that and just take a chance to write down again and just revisit what you wrote down from yesterday about what is your vision for your school? What structures are you putting in place to ensure all students have access to opportunity? This panel this morning, I want you to have that vision in your mind, and then also that question about how are you making sure the structure's in place that all students have access to opportunity. We have an amazing a panel here this morning, as you can see, seated to my left. I'm going to start just real briefly with introductions. Bob Schwartz, down at the end, from Jobs of the Future and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He mainly works on Jobs of the Future Pathways Prosperity Network that he has helped develop. He has literally wrote the book on pathways. I'm not joking about that. He just his new book on multiple pathways, which he's holding up, just come out. So it's always great when you get somebody who just wrote the book on it. So Bob has held a number of positions with starting these pathways with previous work in the education reform movement and in the standards movement in the United States. And then we have Gretchen Morgan seated beside Bob. She is the president of CareerWise Colorado. And she's going to tell you a little bit about CareerWise. Some of our, all of our Colorado schools are actually participating here, have actually participated in CareerWise. But they're trying to set up a youth apprenticeship program in Colorado based off of our Swiss system. And so she's going to tell you a little bit about that and get into design principles there of how do you potentially translate some of these practices we see in Europe and across the world to other places. And then we have Doannie Tran, who is the, make sure I get your title right, Assistant Superintendent for Academics and Professional Learning here in Boston Public Schools. Started his career as an educator and has the graduate degrees also from Harvard, but is going to talk a little bit about how Boston is thinking about and working with industry and thinking about how do you develop these pathways here in Boston. So excited to have someone local to talk about that. And Hanne Shapiro, who used to be recently the innovation director at the Danish Technology Institute, who has looked at multiple pathway systems throughout Europe, not only in Denmark but in other countries as well, and is also helping Vietnam think about how do you set up their apprenticeship system. Bob, to start off with, can you just give us a broad definition of how you define career pathways or multiple pathways? And then what does this look like in the United States and from your experience throughout the world?
That's a nice, simple question to get us started. I think the core idea to kind of keep in your head here is that we're still in the early stages of moving from the notion that somehow the way we used to organize our system, some kids are going on to college, others are going to work, and we've lived with for a long time this kind of divide. I think if there's a single core idea that's animating a lot of the work that I suspect most of us in this room are doing, is that this is no longer a forced choice, that the challenge now is to prepare all young people for both college, and again, college meaning something beyond high school, some credential that has value in the labor market, and career. And the multiple pathways or career pathways idea really springs, I think, from that premise. So the question is, how can we restructure learning? And we argue that it's for the work that we do, which is designed to span grades 9 through 14, We argue that you need to figure out strategies to combine strong academics with a strong career or technical focus. You need to try to do this for, I won't say all kids, but at least as many kids as you possibly can. You need to think about getting young people started while they're still in high school, both on some kind of post-secondary experience and at the same time to get them started on at least, to have a significant enough work-based learning experience to get some feel for the world of work and careers. Again, the premise is that high school is not enough. The pathways idea needs to span secondary and at least early post-secondary. And ultimately, the big challenge is getting many, many more young people through to a first post-secondary credential and then launched in the labor market with skills, work experience, and a credential that has some value so we can get them started. That's, to me, the core idea kind of underlying the career pathways or multiple pathways movement. I should just one last comment on this, and that is one of the things that, when I and two colleagues at Harvard put out our Pathways to Prosperity report in 2011, one of the things that really motivated us to do this was seeing states, and in some cases large urban districts, especially in California, kind of adopting the kind of university admissions requirements as the kind of the default curriculum for all young people, and in some cases actually linking that to graduation requirements. And our premise was if fewer than one young person in 3 by the age of 25 has a 4-year college degree, it's kind of insane to behave as if the whole purpose of the high school system ought to be structured toward that one pathway, since that one pathway is effectively serving roughly one young person in 3.
Yep, and Hanne, can you just explain sort of how you see multiple pathway systems developing from other countries? And then going back to Bob after Hanne is thinking about how you've seen this set up in the United States in particular from these other countries' observations?
And what I'm saying is really not just Europe, but also Australia, and done work in Jordan and in Africa also here within the last few years around vocational education. And I agree completely with Bob, but I would add from a country like my own, if we really want to achieve these multiple pathways, we have to think the foundation at a much, much earlier stage. So compulsory early childhood education and care, where children learn through play, is really hugely important, with educated preschool teachers that know about early learning. Secondly, from my perspective, multiple pathways are also lifelong. Increasingly in Europe, we focus on building these pathways that are somewhat similar, but taking into account opportunities for recognition of prior learning, because obviously if you have been out as an unskilled worker working in construction and whatnot, there are skills bundles that you can use if you move to manufacturing or wherever you go. So from my perspective, multiple career pathways are also, in a sense, modular, with portable skills that you can use, skills bundles that you can transfer to other sectors. So you build again and again like a Lego system. I come from the Lego country, so maybe that's why I think about the Legos. And unless we do that, we do not really achieve equity. Because we've seen this increase, for example, in Southern Europe. You push so you get kids through secondary education, but you have repeat after repeat. You have in Germany kids that get stuck in transition because more and more you have to have both an Abitur and a vocational degree to actually find an apprenticeship place, and so forth and so forth. So these issues with recognition of prior learning, starting early with learning, I think are key to building the pathways later.
Yep. And Bob, design principles that you see from Switzerland, I know you've worked a lot there that apply to other contexts. What are the key design principles when designing these systems?
Well, I mean, the big difference between the strongest European systems and ours is the role that employers play, frankly. They're organized by sector. They are not sitting back and waiting to see what the education system produces and then saying, whoops, sorry, not good enough. Young people don't have either the professional skills or the more technical skills to meet our needs. Employers are at the table from day one. They really drive and help shape the system. They work collaboratively with educators and with government. One reason that I'm such a big fan of the Swiss system is the Swiss system, it's 70% of kids who in the middle of high school opt for the path that allows them to combine learning at a workplace and a well-structured apprenticeship and learning in a classroom. When you're talking about 70% of kids, this is the mainstream system. This is the way most young people in Switzerland go to the equivalent of upper high school in the U.S. So that's a core principle. The second principle implied in the first is these systems, and it's systems is the key word, are really built collaboratively. They're these very, very strong partnerships, both at the local level and at the state and national level. It's a kind of three-party system. There's the role of the state, there's the role of the employers, and there's the role of there are two federal offices that kind of guide the system. But people understand, what their respective responsibilities are. There's a lot of collaboration, and these are kind of dynamic systems. Hard to do here. We're going to hear from Gretchen about the strongest attempt we've yet seen in the U.S. To actually adapt some of those principles without slavishly, thinking that you can simply pick up the ideas from one system and plop them into our context. But that's it for me.
Yep. So I think it's a great transition into actually examining the ways people in different contexts are thinking about developing the system. So Gretchen, what are you trying to develop with CareerWise? What's the process that you've used to develop it, and kind of how does that system look in Colorado?
Yeah. Should we flip through these now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that was really awkward.
Oh, you're good. Yeah.
Uh-oh. I hit the big green arrow, nothing happened.
There it is.
Oh, hey, now
There
it
you are.
happened.
Yeah.
It's all working. So I just wanted to run through a few slides because otherwise I'll just talk really fast and then you'll all be mad at me later. So just to slow down a little bit. First, just why we're doing this, and some of this echoes what Bob has shared, but we really in Colorado have these two persistent problems. One side of the problem is a workforce problem. So this is just a few highlights of current costs for employers of finding talent. So right now, on average, when someone's trying to find a middle skill person, it costs them around $24,000 just to recruit and hire someone. That's getting to be quite expensive for businesses. We have this part of our economy, this middle skill part, which is like some advanced training but not yet four-year degree, is the part where jobs are hardest to fill, take the longest to fill, are the most expensive to fill, and we're not producing really anybody out of our education system to step into those places. And then we have this problem on the other side, which this is referred to at home as the leaky talent pipeline, but really it's the leaky education outcomes slide for Colorado, which is of 100 kids who start in high school, how many of them really do end up with some post-secondary degree and finding their way into the workforce in a place that requires that degree. And it's a very small proportion of our students. So Colorado has this problem, right, of we have a really growing economy that is strong, that needs people with advanced skills. Our education system is not producing those people. Colorado's a lovely place to live. I think it's like 60 degrees there today, just FYI. And so, yeah, not bragging, it's totally fine. But that's how we've managed this problem for like a decade in Colorado, or even 2 decades, is we've just imported talent from other places. That's getting to be expensive, and if you care about Colorado kids, it's also sort of morally wrong. So we're trying to get to pull these two things together with youth apprenticeship. And I just want to add one other note before I get into what we're doing, which is the Hope Index. So I enjoyed the piece of presentation a lot last night. I get really nerdy around data. It's just like a secret fun hobby of mine to dig into things like that. And so I got really nerdy for a while into Gallup's data on the Hope Index, which is basically, they ask people all around the world, they've asked millions of people questions about all kinds of other things, and they ask them questions about their level of hope for the future. And they have found that people don't self-identify as having hope for the future unless they also self-identify these 3 things: that they have a clear goal, that they think hard work will get them there, and that they see more than one pathway they could take to achieve that goal. And having spent my life in education, now 20 years in that field, I think that last one is the place where we're missing the mark, back to what you said about pathways, right? That we aren't helping students see more than one viable pathway. We are talking to them about a single pathway. And so when you add that up with the data that we have in our state, I at least start to feel a little gloomy, right? Like not only do we have kids not achieving post-secondary degrees, but we are leaving them without a sense of hope for their future because they don't see, if they didn't achieve that one path, another way to be successful. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. And then quickly, I do just want to say, CareerWise is a baby entity. We're like 18 months old, but we are standing on the backs and shoulders of a lot of people who've done a lot of work in Colorado for the last 25 years. And I'm not going to go through this timeline, but the highlights would be things like, strong governor leadership around workforce that brought state agencies together. We have really collaborative state agencies between economic development, workforce development, labor ed, and higher ed. Those people know each other. They talk to each other frequently. It's been quite helpful to us that that's true. We have really strong local work happening with businesses around sector partnerships and having companies talk in regional ways about their shared needs. All of that matters because when we go out to talk to a community about youth apprenticeship, we aren't talking to businesses who've never spoken to one another and have never collaborated on something and have never taken that little step to trust that maybe somebody from outside their community could be helpful. That's happened a lot in Colorado, and so we're really fortunate to stand on that. And what we are is this little intermediary, right, sitting among all these parties, trying to help negotiate what are the design parameters of a youth apprenticeship that make it sufficiently attractive to all of you that you just want to do it. And I think this has been one of our big learnings from the Swiss system is it's not as though the Swiss system, at least in our understanding, is a strong government view that then tells people how to behave. Right. It's much more like the Swiss government has listened really carefully to what are the very natural selfish incentives of all the different players and has tried to structure their system so that it behaves like a system, is coordinated, but is incredibly responsive to those selfish needs. And so we're trying to figure out, how much benefit does there have to be for companies? How much benefit does there have to be for students? How much benefit does there have to be for school districts or for training providers so that they want to participate in this, so that this becomes something which can grow and can be sustained by the inputs of those players themselves. And that's a tricky game. We have a sort of starting version of those design parameters. And for students, this is what it looks like. They're at work 2 days a week, starting in their junior year of high school. They continue working through their senior year and 1 year past high school, so an apprenticeship for us is 3 years long. That matters for all kinds of reasons. The quick version is it takes that long to build meaningful skills that will lead to a meaningful credential for a student. It also takes that long for the student to be sufficiently contributing to the company, right? So there's a balance here of getting incentives for everyone. So they continue in their K-12 schooling. They begin to take concurrent enrollment courses in community colleges for their technical training. So at the end of this experience, what a student has is 3 years of work experience. They've been paid wages for those 3 years. They have $20,000 to $30,000, which they could take with them and do great things, or they could have blown totally on pizza in those 3 years, but we hope that they do something more useful, give them a bit of financial literacy training. Although that was funny last night, that turns out that doesn't matter, financial literacy training. I wrote that down.
Are you rethinking your model now?
I am rethinking right now, literally. And they have
that
had-
push and pull we talked about.
Yes, that's right. They have had the chance to earn a year of college credit that someone else has paid for, either their school or their company. At least half of that credit is guaranteed transfer credit, which is a Colorado policy which allows students to be guaranteed that a 4-year college will accept credit from a community college in the way that it was meant, right, as core academic credit, not as like elective credit or something like that. So all these pathways include a semester of that guaranteed transfer credit. I think also really importantly, they have a professional network. And if you're looking at this as an equity issue, I think that's actually quite a big deal. People have the networks that they're born into. Apprenticeship can be a way to build a network that's different than the one that you are born into. So that's what it is for kids. For companies, the benefit is financial, and that's really important. We aren't asking companies to do this because they care about youth. Many of them do. I don't mean to say they're heartless people. They're not. Many of them do, but we're not asking them to do this simply because they care about youth. We're saying, do this because it makes sense to your business. And really, there are 2 ways it can make sense. And this graph comes from the Swiss, so thank you. Hello, thank you, Switzerland, back there, I see you. Which is their model of evaluating return on investment for an apprentice, both during the term of the apprenticeship and after if they're retained. So the sort of red straight line that you see is apprentice wages over the term of the apprenticeship, which do increase some over the apprenticeship. The curve is their productivity. It should not be surprising that in the beginning, they are not as productive as their wage, right? They are 16. They are confused. Their shoes are untied. And they show up at your office, and they're supposed to be productive. They're not. You invest a lot in them at first. And so in the beginning, it's money losing. But the longer that student hangs around, the more productive they become until they are much more productive than the cost of employing them, which again is why it needs to take like 3 or 4 years for an apprenticeship, because it takes that long for the company to make back their money. And so this is sort of a grand average. Dr. Ursula Reynolds, who helps us with all of these things about the Swiss system, would say she's uncomfortable in some ways with this average because there's so many nuances. But on average, the ROI for Swiss companies is about 10%. So if you can make money on an apprentice as a company, then you have an incentive to do it not just right now for us when the economy's good and you have a workforce problem, but you have an incentive to do it all the time. And we think to have a system that's actually going to sustain that kind of incentive has to be present all the time, because this is a very new way for employers to behave. The other benefit to them, talking super fast, I'm sorry, is if they keep an apprentice on, right? Let's say this apprentice comes, they work for 3 years. One of our companies right now, Home Advisor, you might know them. They run a website that like refers you to like plumbers and contractors and things. Home Advisor said to us a few weeks ago that they were feeling an ethical dilemma about one of their software QA testers. This made us all very nervous. Eric was here when this happened. We had like funders in the room and we're like, what do you mean you're having an ethical dilemma? And it turned out the ethical dilemma was we really want to convince this kid not to go to college, okay, because he's really good. And he's really productive. And he's making money for our company right now. Like on this curve, he hopped over that line after about 2 months in their company. So if Home Advisor can manage to convince this kid, you know, ethically decide what you believe about that, if they can convince him to stick around after his apprenticeship, he would make $70,000, $80,000 a year for them at that point. But that would save them that $24,000 it costs to hire somebody. Right? And they have somebody hitting the ground running on day one, so it also saves them the lack of productivity of a new employee coming in. So for companies, there's this for sure benefit of ROI during the apprenticeship, and there's this possible really big benefit of retaining talent afterwards. And some of our companies are so anxious to do that that they're committing to paying college tuition for 4 years following the end of the apprenticeship or 3 years following the end of the apprenticeship to help someone complete a 4-year degree and stay with them, work with them part-time while in school and stay on with them at the end. So that's why companies like to do it. Just really quickly, I want to emphasize we are a tiny, tiny, tiny baby start at this. We started with 116 apprentices this year. So don't ask me anything about how many of them stayed on at the end because we have no idea. They've all just started. We're only 1 year in. But this is just a quick view of 40 employers, 116 apprentices, our wonderful education partners, 3 of which are represented here, which is so great. But that's the picture, and just quickly, these are the pathways that we're in, and I point this out only to say it's important if you're talking about apprenticeship that you not just talk about things that the U.S. has talked about with apprenticeship before. It can't be just advanced manufacturing, for example, on this list. And so, again, taking a page from the Swiss, we really have worked to have financial services, business operations, and IT be pathways alongside advanced manufacturing as a way to start this so that we are, as Bob said, a system, right? We don't want to be like a program that does a thing in a certain sector in a certain geography. We want to be a system that creates incentives for businesses across sectors and kids with different interests, all to find that this is another visible, viable option that they could consider alongside the one option we talk about all the time, which is go and get that 4-year degree.
Yep, so much to go deep on there. So let's start actually with Bob, your perspective on why an intermediary is so important, because she is not operating from a school system. She is not operating from an industry. She is an intermediary. Why is that so important when thinking about these models?
That's a really good question. I mean, I should say just parenthetically, so the Pathways to Prosperity Network, which David alluded to, is now 5 years old. It's a network that consists of a very interesting mix of states, some large ones like California and Texas, some smaller ones, including Massachusetts, Tennessee, Delaware, 3 Midwestern regions without their states, and 2 big cities, more recently New York City and Philadelphia. So that's the context from which I'm coming. If you really want to do what they're doing, whether it's in the sort of youth apprenticeship model that Gretchen has described, or whether it's just more kind of conventionally, if you will, trying to figure out how do you scale up significant work-based learning opportunities for young people, you need some kind of organization that sits between the employer community and the educator community. Ideally, that organization is employer-facing, so it's an organization that employers trust. CareerWise Colorado really came into being largely because of, strong employer leadership that realized that to do something as radical as they're proposing to do, while you absolutely needed government at the table, you needed the nimbleness that you can really only get from a small organization that sits outside. I should say in our work, we have some states where the initiative has really come from political leadership. We have some where it's come from education leadership, but we also have places where it's really been a small, trusted nonprofit organization that has taken the lead. In Arizona, for example, there's a small outfit called the Center for the Future of Arizona. It's a nonprofit. It happens to sit inside Arizona State University, widely respected and trusted as an honest broker. In the Twin Cities, it's the United Way that is the kind of core intermediary. But this is really hard to do. Again, particularly if the goal is to scale up significant work-based learning opportunities for young people without some organization that's staffed to do that can go back and forth between the employers and schools and young people and really do the scaffolding that's really necessary if you're going to have quality experiences that ultimately are going to pay off for employers as well as for young people. As it happens, by the way, I would argue that from what we've seen around the country, the best such organization in any city happens to be right here in Boston. It's called the Boston Private Industry Council. It technically is the city's workforce development board, but it, right from the beginning, for reasons I won't go into, back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was structured and staffed to place career specialists in every Boston high school. It also has a team of people who have kind of company portfolios, and it's been around now for 25 or 30 years. And every time once a year, we run 2 institutes a year for leadership teams from the places that we work with. One of them is always here in Cambridge, and people always come in a half day early so they can spend time really looking at the Boston Private Industry Council to understand how it's staffed, and we now see some examples elsewhere in the country of people trying to figure out how to adapt that model.
Yeah, I want to get to Doannie real quick in the Boston Private Industry. Before we do that, though, Hanne, can you just describe how intermediaries play a role in other countries, particularly in Europe, and then what you're advising Vietnam on as well, and how you set up intermediaries in those contexts as well?
Well, for example, in Australia, they have worked exactly with the same model. In some countries, it's really, with the old institutionalized systems, it's really the employer organizations also taking on board this matching, what do we actually need and what's the other demand. In Denmark, we've actually had quite a lot of success, and that is important to scale and regional location, is actually employees at the schools that come from industry. They have this outreach target to their particular occupations that they cover, and they have like 50% of their time simply goes to go out to talk to companies that previously had, that never had, and it works. It really works well, and the value of it, rather than having a central organization, is really that you get so much more spread if you really want to push the apprenticeship, because we really have and in Germany has the same issue, that in some of those apprenticeship countries, we now have the challenge with we cannot get enough youth to actually choose these occupations, particularly in the technical areas. So it's a doubled outreach strategy, both towards children and parents, and in late school years to create ladders and bridges also from compulsory school into the system. And there, that model functions quite well because you have this local placement. So very important. And the other models we, of course, have created is then these dual opportunities that you can get both an abitur and a vocational qualification because you have this issue of parity esteem. Vietnam is quite another history because they have massive growth of youth and massive youth unemployment and underemployment. So employers came to Denmark, Danish and also some German employers, saying we really have issues with these workers, both in wood industry and in graphical design. that we cannot get the people we need, can we start doing something at a local sectoral level? Because we need a workforce with higher both soft skills, but also technical skills, because we are reaching a higher technology level than Vietnamese companies have at present. So that is what the collaboration is really about. So first defining what should the curriculum look like by having benchmark companies that really have, and that is very important, because if you go to some of the countries in Europe that are now, and I've reviewed some of those countries that are trying to implement in school-based vocational systems, implement apprenticeship learning, where you set the bar for accreditation of companies is really, really important. And it is a balance, because if you have difficulties getting enough companies, then you tend to lower the bar, and you may end up in this, what has been called restrictive apprenticeship. That is, it has formally the features of apprenticeship, but in reality, students get to do very routinized work. So that you really have to be watch out for.
And it is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, more experts on this panel, I should probably not be speaking, that in Switzerland in particular and other countries, the curriculum and the tests are actually developed by those industry associations, correct? The bar is set by those associations.
Yes, that is correct. But with, I'm playing the devil's advocate a little bit, because I think increasingly also the sectors will need to be informed, like the type of analysis and research Burning Glass does, because you see sector convergence, a hybridization of jobs, and the particular companies developing these qualifications might not be perfectly set to it if they are not in the forefront of those occupations. Mm-hmm. And you really have, whether you go to manufacturing, to transport, whatever, you have a big span of really crafts company and high-tech companies. So who sets the bar?
Yep. Yeah, Bob.
Just a quick comment. One of the things that to me has been most intriguing about the Swiss system is this is really competency-based, and young people learn in 3 different environments. There's the workplace, there's the school, and then there's the training center that really focuses on teaching young people kind of the specifics of the industry itself. So the training is not too narrowly focused, and it's not too firm specific, so that young people can take their credentials ultimately portable across the sectors. What the educators do in collaboration with business is really try to figure out, if these are the competencies that young people need, which ones are best taught or learned in which of these 3 different learning center places. So it's this very deliberative process to try to figure out, if these are the things you want young people to know and develop, how do we make sure that there's not a lot of unplanned redundancy, and how do we sort of make sure that each setting understands the things that it really needs to focus on in terms of supporting the development of young people.
But Bob, wouldn't you argue, wouldn't you argue then the issue, and what I've heard from some Swiss, both companies and schools, the argue of the transferability skills, how you actually bridge these 3 learning environments, particularly for the weaker students, is a challenge.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, this is really, complex stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So complexity. Doannie, you're the one in the system as the assistant superintendent here, trying to think about this here in Boston, trying to develop these, and also trying to develop these industry partnerships. You just talk a little bit about kind of your thoughts, and as you are rethinking the high school here in Boston, what you're thinking about doing.
Well, thanks. The hometown hero gets a chance at the mic. This is exciting. So one thing that I want to double down on that Hanne brought up was that this play-based curriculum in early childhood grades, I just want to highlight exactly what I think the through line is there that leads all the way through K-12, which is this idea of agency and executive function, that play-based is just a proxy for the ability for students to make choices that are based upon their interests and needs and their own self-assessment of that. And that has to, I think we do a pretty good job in Boston of doing that in the early grades, and then have this nadir of it all the way basically until high school, when we now ask them suddenly to be able to make choices again, when we've been robbing them of those opportunities for quite a bit. And so we are engaging in an overhaul of our curriculum and teaching practices K-12 to make sure that we are systematically building student agency throughout the trajectory. Another piece that is guiding a lot of our high school work is a recent redesign process that has led to the creation of a citywide, that includes parochial, charter, and BPS, a new set of college career and life readiness framework elements that are generalizable, where it's our attempt to try to standardize exactly what the learning experience in high school will generate, but also what it will look like when we expand learning outside of the classroom and across the city. So if we're putting students into particular learning experiences, how do we make sure that it is meeting this bar for quality? But one thing that I was really heartened by the fact that somebody brought up this equity question, that how exactly are we overcoming this fact, this reality that we do have an informal apprenticeship system that's based almost entirely on social capital. And in our high schools, this is particularly problematic because partnership dollars typically right now flow along those lines from central office to schools that have high social capital, right? So if you've got more money to invest in these partnerships, and if those are concentrated in schools where social capital is already strong, that's not in service of equity. So we have engaged, and I'm speaking for one of my dearest colleagues, Dr. Colin Rose, and his work around creating what we're calling the Opportunity Index. So the Opportunity Index is a multi-level model for you quant geeks out there it's super fun. That takes into account neighborhood level effects to quantify an individual student's need. We already do weighted student formula funding, by which a student who has more identified special needs, maybe they language or learning needs, gets additional funding that goes to their school. But the Opportunity Index measures things like how many people in your census tract have college degrees or advanced degrees. How many people in your census tract call the mayor's hotline to fix a pothole or a broken light bulb? These are proxies for things like neighborhood sort of care for the local community. And so by bundling together all of these metrics, we can actually say to a school, you on average serve a higher need population of students. Therefore, you should receive a greater proportion of partnership funding in order to catalyze some of the relationships that we're talking about here. And so this will ultimately, and this is highly contentious, right? Like you can imagine what this is sort of doing for people in their heads. But this ultimately will help us redesign the high school experience, really the experience K to 12, but in the context of this panel will help us redesign the high school experience, because now these partnerships that are required in order to have these sort of learning experiences for students will be more highly resourced for students who have higher need.
I'm sure we're going to have follow-up questions from the crowd on that. But talk to us a little bit about why you see employers engaging with Boston Public Schools. What's the, Gretchen has talked a bit about why employers are engaging in Colorado. Why do you see them engaging? Why do you see the Boston Private Industry Council engaging as it does here?
I think it's not so different from what people have already brought up relative to the workforce needs. That statistic of the $24,000 to recruit and retain is a stunning one, and we have a high-tech sector city here. We have a ton of startups, biotech, education technology, healthcare more broadly, and those we are exactly in the strike zone that Gretchen is talking about. And so the Private Industry Council has sat at that transition into this new emerging economies, this innovation economy for quite a long time, and has been working really, really closely with BPS to enhance our ability to meet these career college and readiness, life readiness standards. So they've helped us develop those, brought together the workforce partners in order to help us share that common vision, and then to make sure that we're creating the common matches or the correct matches that we're seeking.
Yeah, and I want to get to these equity concerns, and then we're going to go to audience questions here. But Gretchen, from an equity perspective, how are you thinking about this within your system to make sure there's multiple on-ramps into the system? Because I think that helps address some of those equity concerns. How are you thinking about multiple on-ramps into the system and the pathways out of your apprenticeships as well?
So we were clear from the beginning that we didn't want to have things that are barriers for other kinds of programs become barriers to access this. So for example, there's no like grade point requirements to qualify to apply as an apprentice. The only requirement is that you can find adequate time to be an apprentice, which means you have to be close to on track with accumulating credit. You don't have to be all the way there, but you have to be close. And some of our partners, Denver Public Schools has done pretty good work actually in figuring out how to do other things around apprentices to help so that they can have students who need extra support get that while being apprentices. But that was really important to us because we believe, and we have found this to be true actually, that there's a whole group of kids who don't love school, who aren't successful in school, who will find this to be something that is so much better than what they're doing. Not because schools aren't awesome. You all have totally awesome schools, but you know those kids, right? And they very openly say to us, the reason my counselor talked to me about this is that I totally hate school. And we want to make sure that kid has as much opportunity to get into this as a really high achieving kid who sees it as a totally different kind of opportunity. We also have really high achieving kids coming into this with existing professional credentials who see this as a way to accelerate their career. You know, who as 16-year-olds are thinking, this is going to make me more marketable as a 22-year-old. And they're coming at it for that reason. So that was one thing we did, was just not create barriers to entrance that kept kids out. And then we worked with each of our school and district partners to try and have them pay attention to diversity of participants in all different kinds of ways during their recruiting. And at the end of our first recruiting season, gave them all back data about how that went, and looked at how representative was the group of applicants as compared to your general population of potential applicants, and found that in terms of many measures, it was very representative. The one where it was not was gender. We had lots more boys apply than girls, which is not totally surprising, although it was completely irritating as a woman leading this work. But I have to say, for the girls, the hiring pool was different. There's much less imbalance in gender in the hiring pool, which means although there were fewer girls who applied, they were more attractive as employees. So, take that. But we are really working on gender in particular because as we looked at the data in the first hiring pool, that was the place where we have the biggest gap to make up. And so have worked with each of our school and district partners to figure out how can you target communications to girls? How can we connect up with like STEM girls initiatives and other things that are happening already in some of our school partners? These guys have a really great leader around STEM girls engagement from their school and are trying to do more and more of those things to help deal with that one really obvious gap.
And how do you, or how have your school partners, and maybe we can get the school partners to stand up and share as well, how would they message that to parents? So parents see this as opportunity because as we've talked about yesterday, opportunity, at least in the United States, opportunity and college may as well be the same. Four-year college may as well be the same words. In terms of our parent, our vocabulary maybe in the United States, how has that happened? How has that messaging happened?
Yeah, so that has been more of a challenge than we anticipated, actually. So in our first round of recruiting students, it was much harder to find students than we thought it would be. Right, we're only looking for like 120 kids right in the beginning. And it turned out that one of the reasons it was hard to recruit kids was that this perception is so consistent and also so easy to understand. You know, when you say to a parent, if your kid gets a 4-year degree, they're gonna be okay. They're like, got it. Totally makes sense, guaranteed, win. When you say to them, well, if they get into this apprenticeship, they might have more choices. They're gonna have this, and they're gonna have this, and they could use this choice this way, and use this choice this way, and take those guaranteed transfer courses and do this other thing. That is a complicated message that sounds to counselors, maybe, especially, as a threatening message of now you're saying you don't want all my kids to go to a 4-year school. And so there was some resistance from counselors to engage in that conversation with parents. And we did a lot more engagement and training with counselors this fall to try and help with that and help them see that this is something a student could use to go a lot of different places, and that you should want them to be more informed about more choices than just which campus are you going to. And that is a hard conversation, and it's taking quite a bit of time with both parents and counselors to get there. But I will say, when we go out and we have these parent nights, after about a half an hour with parents, their attitudes are very different. But it does take like a discussion. It's not like we sent home a flyer and they're like, oh my gosh, youth apprenticeship is it. Let's do this. It takes a real conversation to get folks there. So it's a lot of face-to-face time right now to help with that problem.
Yeah, and Bob, thoughts on this and how this potentially development of these systems are associated with potentially tracking and how we think about that narrative differently?
Yeah, well, the huge difference here, and I should have said it right at the outset, is obviously, I mentioned our work tends to focus, to span grades 9 through 14, but the reality is we actually start, we think we need to start at least as early as the middle grades, and then develop a kind of systematic year-by-year strategy to increasingly expose young people to the world of work and careers. This can't be done by schools alone. It requires collaboration with community organizations that work with young people as well as with employers. But the point is, if tracking was a system in which it was basically the school people who were deciding, which kid, went into kind of which pot, the college going or the going to work pot. We've got to figure out a strategy to help young people and their families in this much more systematic way actually get exposure to the world of working careers. Who am I? What are my interests and strengths? What's the range of options? How do I get experience inside a broad variety of firms so that by the time I hit the middle years of high school, I'm in a position to make some decisions about what kind of post-secondary education or training do I want that can get me started. That's a big chunk of the problem. I want to come back to the equity question if I can, because I think this is really a big challenge in the U.S. If you think about what Gretchen was describing. As she said, these European systems and this Colorado CareerWise system really works for employers. You can make the sort of return on investment case pretty easily. In the U.S., I mean, unless places are willing to move to this kind of programs that have this kind of intensity and duration, you really can't. It's really hard to make a return on investment argument for to employers, particularly when we're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds who typically are not. We're trying to. The message to young people and families is, don't go straight into work after high school. You need to get some post-secondary education. So it's one reason that we try to design systems that really straddle secondary and post-secondary, is that we think it's actually going to be easier to get employers to engage with community colleges around these pathway ideas and then start using early college and dual enrollment to get young people in high school already started on these post-secondary programs that have strong employer engagement. But the big challenge here is, again, I think somebody alluded to it right at the beginning. It was Gretchen. For these programs ultimately to work, employers do need to make the shift from thinking of this as kind of under the banner of corporate social responsibility or good citizenship. Not that those aren't important motives, but ultimately we need to convince employers this is in their long-term economic self-interest to engage with young people, to think about this in talent pipeline terms. For many employers, actually, given the high costs of turnover, particularly at the entry-level positions, and given their sort of diversity interests, a lot of employers can buy into the argument that we would actually, over time, like to have a workforce that more resembles the community in which we live, and we would like to have a workforce where we think people are likely to stay put if we can invest in them. So there are some assets to build off of. But at the front end, I mean, one of the things that's most striking to me as I move around the country and look at the high-quality CTE programs that really do seem to have strong employer engagement, one of the ironies is that these programs are disproportionately white in most of the places that we work. And I think the reason for that is that African American and Latino parents particularly continue to have this kind of strong negative image, which is totally justifiable in terms of our history. We have this legacy of vocational education as, for other people's kids. Too often our programs were dead-end programs. They weren't connected to the sort of growth parts of the economy. So for us, the messaging, at least the way we've tried to focus on this, we focus, just as Gretchen said, we tend to focus on IT, we tend to focus on the programs with a strong STEM foundation, in advanced manufacturing, in healthcare, in IT, in part to change the image. And we try to message this, that this is all about, it's not about work or college. As I say, all of these programs require some post-secondary education. So it's those things I think if you package them together, we can begin to make a dent in terms of the parental perceptions. I would argue that if we took parents out of the equation and we could put a choice to young people, the choice that the Swiss put. At age 15 or 16, would you rather spend your next 3 years sitting in classrooms only, or would you rather spend that time in a mix of work and learning, getting paid, and getting a credential that has real value in the labor market, and then while still leaving open the option to continue on to get more education. I think if we put that choice to young people, an awful lot of young people would vote for with their feet and say, yeah, I would like to spend more time in more adult settings, getting started with my life, and not just kind of running in place, as an awful lot of kids are doing, particularly in the last 2 years of high school.
Doannie, I want to go to specifically how you're thinking about college and career advisement and those conversations you're having with students as well for you.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that there is potential pitfall in treating this primarily as a pipeline issue, that there's also a demand side problem here around. Because I would imagine that even if we sent a fully diverse, 50% African American, 50% Latino, I'm just throwing out numbers, but into some of these systems, we would still see differential outcomes and disproportionality on the back end, and then that is also true going through the K-12 system. We just have bad advising that's rife with the sort of bias that we're sort of trying to dismantle via some of these gap-closing strategies. Now, I think the part of the reason why this is a challenge for us is that we too often, I think, treat culturally proficient engagements and learning, and I'm talking about the advising process and also the matching process and all of those places where bias comes out. We treat that culturally responsive work as primarily a skills problem, right? It is, you don't have the skill of having a culturally proficient conversation. That is one of my biggest learnings from the past couple of years. I think that is a fallacy. It is not primarily a skills problem. What we have learned in BPS, as we've taken principles, 128 principles, through 15 hours of training about the history of race, culture, intersectionality, implicit bias. As we went through that, it dawned on me, because I just listened to people who were experts on this, that there's a knowledge problem. Like, there's actually a base level of knowledge about the history of race and bias that most people just don't have, simply. And so then we started to expand those trainings and mini versions of them to partners, after-school partners, other people who engage with children on a day-to-day basis. And I think this conversation is making me remember that our overall strategy is to make sure that everybody in the city engages in this sort of capacity building, knowledge building. Like, you can't have equitable outcomes and engage with the questions of equity unless you actually understand the historical context, which is a knowledge problem and a skills problem. It's actually sort of a mirror and a map of the knowledge skills problem that exists across content areas too. But that's something that we're learning here in Boston. So the mayor is engaging in race dialogues across the city over the course of the next few months. But I also think that we can do more in partnership with private industry to make sure that this culturally responsive training that they're doing in their sites is actually informed by some of the things that we've been doing in BPS, which I think is more progressive than most industries and most districts are currently doing.
Hanne, your perspective on this, and also how
Yes.
equity concerns internationally?
First, a comment regarding what you're telling, because I very much agree. In Denmark, we actually took the initiative about 10 years ago because we could see also from PISA data, we could see at vocational schools, Arabic, Turkish boys had a bigger dropout rate and had difficulties finding apprenticeships. So we have actually introduced in the model of mentors for these young people, and it's on a voluntary basis. You receive some training, but you're an adult with good networks. I, for example, have constantly 5 to 6 boys that I mentor, and it takes so little effort, and it has really spread because people think it even if you have people who are against immigration and so forth, they can see the advantage, but they get education, they get into jobs, so they don't become a socioeconomic problem. Mm-hmm. So they're very, very different rationales for that. I see in many systems now in Europe that you have partial degrees, 2-year degrees introduced, and I tend to worry about it because you really need to know, is it just because of degree hell that you want to have this credentialism? Everybody should have a degree. Are there actual jobs, skilled, semi-skilled jobs out there? Or is it just short-time employment? So the question of whether should you let everybody in from the start due to sort of broad access, or should you have preparatory pathways, particularly taking into account the effects of automation and advanced robotics, higher demands for cognitive skills. In particular, many young people come out with insufficient, we know that from PISA, insufficient numeracy and literacy, and you can see that linking into their ability to use ICT for problem solving and so forth. So I think there are some issues there in the design also of pathways. Should there be like I think the German called it Kette, links, that you have this step and then you can put forward because you have the baseline in place, which is not just about necessarily cognitive skills, it can also be your whole behavior, changing from coming with a plastic bag to actually coming with a bag and so forth and so forth.
Yep. I want to get to audience questions, actually. I have tons more questions up here. But Mary with the microphone. Lance with the microphone. Questions you have maybe for the panel?
Gretchen, I have 2 questions for you, and I have to tell you, if I'd seen your presentation before David asked the first question, I would be saying this is the #1 eye-opener. I am really fascinated with the work you're doing in Colorado, so thank you to America Achieves and to you for sharing this with us. 2 questions. First of all, my understanding is a junior has 16 hours of work experience. A senior has 24 hours of work, and post-secondary 32 hours of work. During that junior and senior year, what kind of accommodations do schools have to make to allow for them to not be in school? That's question 1. I'm not going to give up the mic, but I'd love your answer.
Okay. So the quick answer to that is there are a variety of ways, and some of them had schedules that were pretty enabling from the start. So one of our district partners, Cherry Creek Public Schools, has an A-day, B-day schedule, and they stacked all their classes in A-day, and then they're free on B-days, so they do it alternating days, which gets them 16 hours this year, but also will get them 20 hours next year without any other augmenting of their schedule. These guys, STEM, use a lot of concurrent enrollment. They have that kind of flexible schedule, and they do a lot of concurrent enrollment, and so where they needed greater flexibility, they push kids into concurrent enrollment more because the schedule at the community college is more flexible than it can be at a K-12 campus, and so they have them taking core academics at community colleges more often. Fort Collins Early College, who is here. Sandy, where are you? You're not at the Colorado too. What's up, Sandy? These guys are a full early college school, and so they have a very flexible schedule with students on primarily a community college schedule by the time they're juniors in high school. Another school in Denver Public Schools is a competency-based school. DSISD. Are you guys, I can't remember you guys here. You are, right? Yes. So competency-based. So when I met, one of their students spoke at a Denver Public School board meeting a few weeks ago, and other kids from other DPS schools were talking about how their schedules were kind of a problem. And then this young woman said, oh, it's not a problem for me at all. My school's competency-based, and I've been accelerating my core academic attainment. And so by the time I got to my junior year, I had all kinds of time in my schedule. So I'm doing these classes here and these classes here, but I have a lot of time because I'm on an accelerated pace. So they're doing that in a lot of different ways, but I think two things. One is where there are things like competency-based happening, it definitely is enabling. Where there are things like STEM happening, it's also enabling. Those schools have become accustomed to working with industry in a way that has had them flex for other reasons, maybe for internships or work-study things or whatever. The other thing I would say is if you are at a system level, like if you're running a high school or if you are a district superintendent who looks after a set of high schools, I also think you could use youth apprenticeship as something that fundamentally disrupts that structure of the high school, which is so hard to change. I mean, school schedules in high schools are like, from God on a stone tablet. And if you ever talk about a change, you are going to be banished from the country, And I think this is the kind of thing that can be used to cause disruption, to create a school to figure out how to at least do competency-based math, for example. Because gosh, if we just had competency-based math, which is better anyway, if we just had that, our schedule would be more flexible and then more kids could access these opportunities.
Doannie, can you talk a little bit about how you think about strong academics and strong career, and then particularly thinking about school structure as well? How does that work?
So
there's not easy questions on
No,
this panel.
it's been a rough week in terms of school start times here in Boston Public Schools, if you're following the news at all. This is going to be a great school committee meeting tomorrow. Very excited. In terms of trying to ensure, Boston has over time become very much an autonomy-driven district, which I think may be a common theme in terms of the evolution of a lot of districts in the room. And so how does a district think about ensuring a bar for quality within that context when you don't exactly have the same command and control infrastructure that was true of central offices 10, 15 years ago? And so the issuing a common umbrella of what we consider to be rigorous academic experiences in the form of the Essentials for Instructional Equity, which is our sort of vision statement for high quality instructional practice, and making sure that we have created guidance about what each of those elements looks like within any context where they might occur, is a way of ensuring that common bar for rigor. It does not yet solve for the problem of quality control and monitoring, and we have to judge for ourselves whether or not we want to do that. But it does provide some common language that helps us set expectation. And from a structural standpoint, I think that central offices tend not to be in the business of making it easy to do the right thing. We make it actually surprisingly difficult to do the right thing sometimes. And so then making sure that as we use the Essentials for Instructional Equity as our guiding document for what we want to see in any learning context in the district, including out of school time, then making sure that we're providing example schedules at every single level that map out how you would use school time to meet that vision is another piece of work that we're currently engaged in right now in partnership with organizations like the PIC, Success Boston, other organizations to help us figure out this sort of school time problem.
I appreciate the information. It's great to hear. Second, and I did think of a third, but maybe I'll have to take that up afterwards.
Let's go with two.
Second question, you made a point of the importance of working together, state legislature, Department of Education, and the various state offices.
Yeah.
Is that critical for success, or if you don't have that, is there any hope?
So I guess I would say, I think at some level it is critical for success, but just like I said before, sometimes things are enablers, but that also means your disruption can become the reason that those things happen. I think the same is true of this, right? Which is if you don't yet have great collaboration among those entities, excitement and energy about apprenticeship could be used to leverage and get that excitement. And I guess I feel like CareerWise's story is a story of being incredibly opportunistic, right? Like it's not that on that timeline that was on the slides before that 25 years ago someone imagined, and at the end of this there will be CareerWise. Like that's not true at all. It's much more like there's this group of people. Noel Ginsberg is our founder. He's a business owner who's interested in youth development, and he got really energized about this, started talking to other people, talked to the governor, got them energized. And this energized group of people looked at what is sitting around us and how can we make very good use of what is sitting around us to get something off the ground. And what we don't have is the perfect alignment of the Swiss system. Every time that someone from Switzerland shows me the diagram of their system, and it has all these arrows showing how permeable it is, my eyes tear up, and I'm like, man, that's so beautiful. Like, we don't have that, right? We are scrapping together and taking advantage of things that do exist and figuring out how they can be repackaged or manipulated or adjusted just a little bit to enable this to happen. So what I would say is, that was true for us, but what will be true in other states will be different. And it's just going to be more about the sort of crafty entrepreneurship, basically, of the founding folks to figure out the right combination to make it happen.
And Bob, so much perspective on this from the multiple states that you've worked with and cities.
Yeah, the two states in our network that have made the most progress have had really strong alignment. They happen to be Tennessee, a red state, and Delaware, a blue state. But in both cases, you had governors who were able to kind of connect the dots for people. Here's the economy we have. Here's the economy we aspire to. Here's the current skills distribution of our workforce. Here's the skills distribution we need to attract and retain the kinds of companies that we need to have here if we're going to have a strong economy that's going to actually support a good standard of living for everyone. And then here's why it's important for us to both increase post-secondary attainment, but also get many more people out the door with skills that align with the regional labor market needs here. And they were able to create, in both states, cross-agency, cross-sector partnerships where people kind of, worked collaboratively together to figure out a statewide strategy. And I would argue that, whether you're talking about a state or whether you're talking about a city or a region, those same principles kind of apply. Can you do this without that? Yes, you can, but it's much more difficult, frankly.
Here we go. Next question.
John Campbell from Gwinnett County Schools in suburban Atlanta. All 20 of our high schools give the OECD test for schools. And one of the findings we see is that our kids don't see the relevance of their learning with their future lives or with their current life. Do you have any data that shows that having these internships increase that feeling of relevance and therefore leads towards higher graduation rates?
So we're way too young to have data, right? But I would say, I'm looking at the Swiss again. This was a thing we learned from the Swiss, and really just talking to youth in Switzerland, is they describe that very differently. Youth in Switzerland who've chosen apprenticeships, I'm thinking of one kid in particular who his plan at the end of compulsory school was to end up in university doing really theoretical study, to do sociology. And, but he did not want to keep studying theoretical things to be how he got there because he was so bored with it, right? At age 15, he was like, ugh, this is not relevant. I'm so bored with this irrelevance. And so he did an apprenticeship that was in robotics and electronics, and he did the coursework alongside of that such that his entrance to university was really easy at the end of that. He had to sort of pass a test and go, really easy. And I met him at the end of his apprenticeship, and he was going to university in the next 6 months after we talked to him. And Swiss kids in general, I think, talk about choices in a more practical way, right? Like instead of saying, I'm at the end of compulsory education, my God, which choice will I make right now? It determines my life. They're more like, I have a choice to make right now. I'm gonna make this one now because I know at the end of it I'm gonna have these other choices. And at the end of that, I'm gonna have these other choices. And I think the relevancy of I can make different choices at a different time so I can find what's relevant to me and then not be trapped in that one choice is very empowering to them.
We, my wife and I have taken 3 groups of Americans to spend typically a week studying the Swiss system, and one of the things we always do is have a panel of people, of 25-year-olds, that is people who are 2 or 3 years out and talking about their lives, and inevitably, half of these young people are actually now working in fields different from the field in which they apprenticed. And this comes back to the sort of both the permeability of the system and the notion that these systems, and this is again a bias of mine, it almost doesn't, ideally you want kids to make informed choices, to pick a field where there's high growth and high demand, and where if you actually start working in that field, you can be on a path of upward mobility. I mean, for me, this is a huge, the argument for doing this has a heck of a lot to do with our stalled economic mobility, particularly for young people. But the reality is, if you do this right, you're both giving, this has a very strong youth development dimension, which you can only get from work, this development of a sense of agency and efficacy, et cetera. To come back to your question, though, I actually think we do have a lot of data that around the power of applied learning and the power of strong CTE systems. If you look at, graduation rates, if you look at post-secondary enrollment rates, the one really strong study that we have about career academies, which goes back a couple of decades, actually showed, it's interestingly, relatively weak impacts on educational outcomes, but strong labor market outcomes later, particularly for males, especially for African American males. So I think it's, what you're really talking about here is strategies for dealing with engagement. I mean, that's your point. That is, what you want is kids to come out with some sense of, I've got some passion. I feel some sense of ownership and responsibility for my own development. I'm in settings where I'm getting, the kind of encouragement and support from adults. These programs, again, several of us have alluded to this, at their best, they also address the social capital question. That is, they put kids in settings with other adults. They begin to form networks, and they begin to at least have some of the kinds of advantages that kids growing up more typically in sort of professional families kind of bring with them anyway.
Doannie, data you've seen on student engagement, or how you're thinking about that here in Boston?
Yep. I don't have much to add, actually, above and beyond what Bob and Gretchen have already shared, except that, of course, don't you love that answer? Like, I don't have anything to add, but I'm going to add something anyway. But that there's a fair amount of data around the early college effects as well, which which I think is important to note, and that I think the logic of why that works does transfer. That seeing that this is going to have a downstream benefit for me increases the engagement. Although I do think the effect of what Gretchen was talking about earlier around the opportunity cost of exploring some of these options as sort of a tentative engagement, like I'm going to go test this out, feels much riskier, I think, to American youth than it does to youth internationally, which I think is the effect that Gretchen is referring to. And we see that, I think, in lots of different fields where people are a little gun shy to go into long professional training programs. The number of black males in medical school over business school, for example, is pretty substantial, even though there's only a year or two difference, depending on the program, and law school the same way. And I think that just keeping that in mind and building some value around that risk-taking. So I imagine there's also a cohort effect that's also in play. Like, you don't want to be out of sync with your peers, which I think is another thing that I wonder if anybody's studied.
Yep.
Thanks, guys. My name's Adam Robb. I'm a Calgary, Alberta, Canada teacher. And I can really relate exactly to what you just said. With my students, if cost at the end of high school is at all a factor, that's the determining factor. So engagement in learning is, do I see a pathway forward? Well, how much does it cost? So that's number one. So the kids who are going to college and university are those who can afford it for the most part. So I think that's something that needs to be talked about, especially in the States where tuition is 5 times what it is in Canada, I would say. And I don't think that's very complicated, that's at the center of it. Secondly is like the socioeconomic divide where, some of the teachers I talk to who are kindergarten teachers, some kids come in already being able to read, and some kids come in and they've never held a book before. They don't know which way it goes and things like this. And right from the very start, because of what's happening at home, they're on this track to not feel good at school and not feel like they are a learner, right? So anything you can do to break those barriers down. I think I'm talking about this right now because it's like these programs, I still think it's only going to be attractive to those who feel good about their learning in school so far. And I see what is attempting to happen is to try and catch some of those that don't necessarily see a pathway forward. But in all realistic terms, I really believe it's still only going to catch those who feel good about their school already. Okay, and then the other part is that I work with 16, 17, 18-year-olds every day, and they don't want most of the jobs that are out there. And this is a tricky thing as well, right? So we can match them up with apprenticeships at so-and-so company in our city, but the kids aren't saying that they want those jobs. And this is a real tricky thing as well, right? And then you can see this because then they choose if they do go into college or university, then most of them switch programs or drop out after first year. And that risk of going into something, how do I say this? It's a huge risk to go into something and then to try and jump out and start over again because the cost factor. And any way we can address that, but it is generally about the cost and the pathway forward. So I don't know if that's an actual question, just more of a statement, but it's kind of like, it's really hard because these kids, they don't know what they want because they haven't had any experience. School isn't very engaging for high school youth overall, and so there has to be something real during that time to give them a real experience so they can gain a real sense of self to know what they actually want. But there is a huge divide in what they're graduating with and what they're going into university with because they're all, 60% in Canada are switching programs or dropping out after first year university or college, right? So there's some disconnect there.
In the past 20, well, let's say 10 years, 8 years, there's been a consortium of community groups that have provided college and career counseling to almost every BPS student that is interested in it, and that has been correlated. I mean, you can see how shaded I'm being with my language as a quant person, but that there's a correlation that has driven increases in high school graduation rates, but that's only part of the problem that I think you're highlighting, that at least some element of this, and this is building on this idea that agency is part of the goal, right? Like that you build agency starting in early childhood, you continue that thread and through line of agency, but that at some point, that has to shift into some level of critical consciousness about the system that they're in, because otherwise, I think we create a lot of cognitive dissonance with our students of color, because we're basically saying like you need to go into this workplace, and you need to code switch, and you need to be different than who you are, and then that sense of belonging and that constant stereotype threat of having to represent an entire race of people at all times within a somewhat foreign environment is, I think, why you see a lot of students who sort of flip back out because it's not a very welcoming space. And so thinking and empowering our high school students with this element of, yep, I'm here, I'm gonna do this thing really well, and I'm also going to dismantle I'm gonna take what I learn here as an agent of change in the system, is a very empowering thing that I don't think we do enough, that I think is a critical lever for getting kids to engage in these experiences that might seem somewhat threatening at the outset.
Yep. And Hanne, exploration or ways you've seen it done so that students are making informed choices and choosing something that they're engaged in. How have you seen that done in other systems or design principles we should think about?
Where it works best, I think it starts early in terms of broad exposure, not just as soda visits where you come out and spend 2 hours and you get the rah-rah-rah talk that doesn't really say anything. Also addressing the fact that some of the kids, in fact, do not have sufficient cognitive skills to actually go into a lot of occupations. But it's very vocationally toned, so suddenly kids that have not been able, that have not passed the degree, the state exams in 9th grade in math, for example, boy, but it makes sense that I can calculate, because I actually have to calculate whether I put in a liter of rum in a dessert or it's just 10 centiliters and so forth. So that is another way of building it, but otherwise really having these project-based learning where you get exposed to different parts of society is, I think, the way to go about it.
Yep.
And some companies have started to actually work and expose the children to genuine challenges within the company, private or public, that they have not solved. And within those projects, kids then work on these challenges, and lo and behold, very often they come back with answers. So that also creates linkages to companies in an interesting way.
Yep. Gretchen, and then Bob, I have one final question for you.
Okay. So just thinking about this from the company side a little bit, having been a high school principal where I've tried to maintain a lot of business relationships and have internship experiences for my students, I was always coming to companies sort of begging and asking, right? Like, would you please take this kid? Would you please let them have a little time? And one of the things that we're finding, even as early as we are, is that when companies see apprenticeship as a human capital strategy, it causes them to be willing to engage with youth in other ways, because then that becomes selfish too, which is it becomes talent scouting, right? And so our companies who posted jobs that were like unappealing jobs and they didn't get kids applying for them in the marketplace in the first year came to us and were like, what's going on? Why don't all these kids want our jobs? And we're like, they don't know you. Their parents don't know you. Your field is not well understood. You're going to have to do some engagement, right? Which suddenly meant they were willing to spend time with kids and families and schools that they were never willing to do before. And so I think part of this problem of kids don't want the jobs that are available is just that they don't know what they are. Like, they've just no idea. Our largest employer in our first year was an insurance company. Dude, no one wants to work in insurance, right? And yet, Pinnacle Assurance hired 23 young people to work with them last year because they did engage with kids in those schools and with their families. And kids found out that Pinnacle is a really great company. And they became really curious about insurance. Like, I feel like if you can make a kid curious about insurance, like literally you can do it about anything, right? But you need companies to show up and be present to do those things.
Yep. Bob, I want you to kind of conclude us here, kind of put some summarizing thoughts on this as our last question, but I also want you to think about and address, we had a broad conversation yesterday about the skills needed for skills and competencies for 21st century work. And how do we ensure that when you're developing these multiple pathway systems, that all of those, that these are not just dead-end skill development, which I think is part of the concern when you're talking maybe about apprenticeships, is that 10 years down the road, they're not going to have the skills, and obviously there's a lifelong learning capacity there that you have to build in. But kind of connect it back to your concluding thoughts as well to how we make sure that the 21st century skills and competencies are developed in all these pathways.
Yeah, thanks.
The easy questions.
Yeah. So let me make 2 points and then come back to the big one, and I think they're connected. First, I think part of the need here is for us to really do a much better job of actually putting some pretty tough data in front of parents and school people and young people generally. This gets to this question of what's it going to take to make space for a much more intentional effort to really put career readiness at the center of the work that collaboratively we need to do at the community level. Part of it really means, helping people understand what the costs are, both in human terms and economic terms, of continuing to behave as if everybody's going to go off to a four-year college or university and live happily ever after. Only 6 in 10 who start a four-year college or degree actually finish. If you look at the returns, economic returns to 25-year-olds with four-year degrees, what you see is that nearly half of them are actually working in jobs that didn't traditionally require a four-year degree. You all know about the student debt burden in the U.S., given the high cost of education, average debt burden, $28,000. Total student debt now exceeding total credit card debt in the U.S. And if you actually look at the academic returns, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but right around the same time we released our report in 2011, a book came out called Academically Adrift. I won't bore you by describing it, but basically it makes a very powerful case of how few young people in four-year degree programs, even those who are succeeding in four-year degree programs, what a relatively weak job four-year colleges and universities do in equipping people with what we think of as this kind of the core academic and professional skills really needed, critical thinking, problem solving, et cetera. And then on the more affirmative side, we now have some pretty strong data showing that even 10 years post-graduation, that those with two-year technical degrees that actually align with their regional labor markets are keeping pace with the earnings of those with four-year degrees. So part of it is giving people that picture of what the, and by the way, very important piece of data, which is that if you're in the upper quartile, if your family's in the upper quartile economically, your kid is 7 times more likely to complete a four-year degree than those in the bottom quartile. Now, this is not, all this is to suggest, yes, we need to actually work much, much harder to get many more kids who ought to be getting four-year degrees to actually get them there with lots of supports, financial and otherwise. But we have to give people the data. The second thing we have to do, in my view, is, as I said, is really prioritize college readiness. In New York City, I'm working with a group of leaders across the system trying to figure out, what we're working on is something we're calling a compact for career readiness. Basically, the question is, what kinds of experiences in school and out, and this comes back to the Calgary question, do you need to put in place for young people beginning in grade 6 that will really put them in a position to make more intelligent, informed choices about careers. And the reason we say this is not a school problem, this needs community organizations, it needs higher education institutions, it needs employers, as well as school people. For me, I'm not smart enough to make predictions about what the skills are that people are going to need, 20 years out. What I do know, though, I think, is that, and when I look at strong European systems in particular, what I see is systems that are able to get people safely through adolescence, out the other end by age 20 or 21 or 22, with a strong underlying set of learning skills, if you want to put it that way, a sense of agency and efficacy because they've been able to complete a program, a sense of having a future, and a sense of the ability to kind of navigate in the adult world. And I think that if you look at the U.S., we've got 3 million kids 16 to 24 who aren't in school and aren't at work. They're the sort of highest priority in a sense of kids we need to help. But we've just got a ton of other kids. If you think about all the 2/3 of young people who arrive at 25 without a four-year degree, that we just need a much, much more robust strategy to get them this skills and work experience so they've got some sense that they can actually control their own future.